The rook, often overlooked in favor of more dynamic pieces like the queen or knight, is a cornerstone of chess strategy and endgame mastery. It represents power, control, and precision, operating along the unyielding ranks and files. In this video, we will delve into the psychology of the rook, exploring its symbolic significance, its strategic potential, and the mindset required to wield it effectively. From opening principles to game-clinching moves, the rook is a silent powerhouse that can transform your gameplay. The rook has long been a symbol of power and stability, both within the game of chess and in broader cultural contexts. Its unique shape, a strong, solid tower or castle, evokes images of fortresses and impenetrable defenses. Historically, the rook was often associated with the concept of strength and protection, as castles and strongholds were essential elements of military strategy throughout medieval times. This symbolism is not lost in chess, where the rook represents a steady, reliable force capable of launching decisive attacks or providing a solid foundation of defense. In fact, the rook's role in chess often mirrors its real-world counterpart, steadfast, unyielding, and crucial to the overall structure of the game. In chess, the rook's linear movement, restricted to the ranks and files, allows it to control vast swaths of the board. This ability gives it a psychological edge in the minds of both players and spectators, as its reach seems unassailable when well-positioned. Unlike the knight, whose movement is irregular and more unpredictable, or the queen, which combines the abilities of both the rook and the bishop, the rook's force is simpler, yet no less potent. Its straightforward nature reflects a kind of mental clarity. It represents pure power in its most unadulterated form, able to create long-lasting pressure along open lines, challenging opponents to either confront it head-on or adapt their strategy to avoid its path. The rook's traditional role as a defensive piece also plays a significant part in its psychological impact. When castled, the rook is often part of the player's safe zone, a position where it can guard the king and, in many ways, symbolize the protection of the game's most important asset. However, this defensive association is only one layer of its complexity. As a game progresses and the board opens up, the rook often transitions from a defensive piece to a highly offensive one, especially when there are open files or weaknesses in the opponent's position. This duality between offense and defense is one of the rook's most psychologically potent qualities, as it can swiftly switch from being a passive protector to an active assailant, keeping the opponent on edge. The psychological pressure exerted by a well-placed rook can be immense. It not only commands space, but can force an opponent into making difficult decisions. The looming threat of a rook on an open file or near the opponent's king can create an atmosphere of tension, often leading to mistakes. The presence of a rook in critical moments of the game often forces the opponent to calculate numerous variations in an attempt to neutralize it, sometimes to the point of mental exhaustion. This can lead to a subtle, but very real, psychological warfare, where the opponent feels increasingly overwhelmed by the potential of a single piece. What makes the rook particularly fascinating in the psychological study of chess is its ability to evoke different reactions from players depending on the context. For an experienced player, a rook on an open file or in a central position may immediately signal an impending shift in the balance of power. For a less experienced player, however, the rook's full potential might be underestimated, leading to underutilization or misplaced confidence. This disparity in perception underscores the deeper psychological understanding required to wield the rook effectively. Its true strength is often realized not through brute force, but through careful positioning, subtle threats, and a deep awareness of the opponent's vulnerabilities. In many ways, the rook also serves as a reminder of the balance of power within a chess game. It is neither the most mobile piece nor the most versatile, yet it can often prove to be the most decisive. This paradox, the rook's simplicity in movement combined with its profound impact on the game, creates a psychological dynamic where the player's confidence in their ability to control the game grows with every strategic placement of the rook. As the game progresses, the sense of calm and control that comes with an effectively placed rook contrasts sharply with the anxiety it can evoke in the opponent, knowing that the threat of an advancing rook is always looming in the background. When combined with other pieces, the rook's power is magnified exponentially. Pairing two rooks on the same file or rank is a classic example of how the piece can exponentially increase its effectiveness. This doubling of rooks increases the psychological pressure on the opponent, forcing them to defend against multiple threats at once. For the player with the doubled rooks, the satisfaction of executing such a maneuver is not just in the material advantage it provides, but in the realization that the opponent is now faced with an overwhelming task, neutralizing two forces that can command entire sectors of the board. Ultimately, the rook is a reflection of both the game's strategic depth and the psychological complexities inherent in chess. It is a symbol of patience and precision, qualities that every player must develop in order to master the game. The presence of a rook on the board invites contemplation of how best to maneuver, how best to protect or attack, and how to turn the tide in one's favor through deliberate and often understated moves. Understanding the psychological nuances of the rook is essential for anyone seeking to elevate their game, as this piece carries not just the weight of its movement, but the weight of the mental battles that unfold alongside it. The rook's strengths in chess are often celebrated for their simplicity and precision. It moves only along the ranks and files of the chessboard, but within these confines, it becomes a formidable force capable of controlling vast stretches of space. Unlike other pieces, such as the queen, which combines the abilities of both the rook and the bishop, or the knight, whose movement is erratic, the rook's linear path is its defining feature, giving it a unique and straightforward power. It doesn't require complex coordination with other pieces to exert influence. Its reach alone makes it a piece that commands attention. The rook's strength lies in its ability to dominate these open lines, creating channels of control that no other piece can match. In the opening phase of the game, the rook's power is not immediately apparent. Its early positioning is often constrained, as it must first be freed from its original square, either by castling or by moving other pieces to open up its path. The early game is generally more focused on the development of pawns and minor pieces, but the rook's potential is already beginning to take shape. Once the center of the board is cleared and the pieces are developed, the rook can begin to operate at full strength, asserting its dominance over open files and creating threats along the ranks and files. One of the most essential elements of the rook's power is its ability to control open files. A file is considered open when there are no pawns blocking it, and it is along these open files that the rook can exert maximum pressure. A rook placed on an open file can dominate the board, controlling a column from top to bottom, with little ability for the opponent to counter its reach. This control is a double-edged sword, however, as occupying an open file also puts the rook in the line of fire for any counterattacks or tactical threats from the opponent. Thus, the decision to place a rook on an open file is not one to be made lightly, as it involves balancing the potential for long-range dominance with the vulnerability it creates. The key to unlocking the rook's true potential is realizing how important these open files are. Once the pawns are moved from their starting positions, the opponent is left with fewer safe spaces to maneuver their pieces. A rook placed on an open file can exploit this weakness, forcing the opponent into a defensive position. Even if the opponent's pieces are not immediately threatened, the mere presence of a rook on an open file can create a psychological pressure, forcing the opponent to spend valuable time and resources trying to neutralize the threat, often diverting attention from other important areas of the board. Beyond open files, the rook excels in controlling long distances. Its linear movement makes it an excellent piece for long-range attacks, where other pieces, like the knight, are limited by their unique movement patterns. The rook is free to travel across the board, applying pressure wherever needed. A rook in the middle of the board is often at its most dangerous, as it can potentially reach any part of the chessboard, targeting weak points in the opponent's position. Unlike knights or bishops, which have limitations in their range due to the nature of their movement, the rook's power is constant, unaffected by the type of position it finds itself in. This makes it a particularly reliable piece for carrying out both strategic plans and tactical surprises. The rook's ability to control both horizontal and vertical lines makes it an incredibly versatile piece in the hands of a skilled player. Unlike the queen, which has a wider range of movement due to its combined rook-bishop nature, the rook's simplicity can be deceptive. It requires less intricate coordination than the queen, and, as a result, can often outmaneuver opponents who focus too heavily on the more complex interplay between the queen and other pieces. By controlling files and ranks, the rook does not just support other pieces, but becomes the anchor for much of the game's strategy, whether it's launching an attack, defending critical areas, or controlling vital spaces. In a more tactical sense, the rook's ability to act as a piece of support is unparalleled. While other pieces may be more specialized in specific tasks, such as the knight's ability to leap over other pieces or the queen's flexibility, the rook's primary role is often to control the board's geometry, dictating the movement of all other pieces. It is particularly effective when doubled up, with two rooks on the same file or rank. The power of two rooks working in tandem is immense. The combined threat of these two pieces amplifies the pressure on the opponent, often forcing them into defensive positions or making them vulnerable to devastating tactical blows. The psychological pressure of a pair of rooks on the same line can be overwhelming, often pushing an opponent to make mistakes in their desperation to neutralize the threat. In the context of an endgame, the rook's power becomes even more pronounced. As the board clears and the number of pieces decreases, the rook is no longer confined by the need to protect other pieces or stay within close proximity to the king. It can operate more freely, moving across the board to pick off pawns, target exposed kings, or assist in creating a checkmate. It is during this phase that the full potential of the rook is realized. The vastness of its reach allows it to cover entire sections of the board in a matter of moves, giving it an ability to control tempo and direction in a way that no other piece can. This is where the rook truly shines as a strategic powerhouse. able to execute plans that no other piece can match in terms of flexibility and reach. In addition to its raw power, the rook is also a piece that demands respect in psychological terms. It operates in a way that is both direct and inevitable. Its movements are calculated, deliberate, and unambiguous, and its threats are clear to both players. There is no room for misinterpretation or guesswork with the rook. This sense of clarity makes the rook a key piece for psychological warfare, as its threat is always real, always immediate, and always forcing the opponent to react. A well-placed rook doesn't just control space, it controls the flow of the game, dictating the rhythm and pace at which moves must be made. It's a constant reminder that, while the queen may be the most powerful piece, the rook is the steady, silent enforcer of strategy, able to turn the tide of the game with a single move or a subtle shift in position. Ultimately, the rook's strength is rooted not only in its movement, but in its psychological and strategic influence on the game. The ability to dominate both ranks and files, control open spaces, and support other pieces makes the rook an indispensable asset on the board. Whether used for attack or defense, the rook's linear power, combined with its versatility and adaptability, places it among the most important pieces in chess. The careful player understands that the rook's true strength lies not in flashy maneuvers or quick attacks, but in its steady, controlled presence that gradually shapes the flow of the game. In the opening phase of a chess game, the primary objective is to develop the pieces efficiently while ensuring the safety of the king. The rook, traditionally considered a more passive piece in the opening, is often left to wait in its corner, tucked behind the pawns. However, despite its initial inactivity, the rook's potential begins to take shape as the game progresses, particularly after castling. This phase, often described as the transition from opening to middle game, is where the rook can begin to make its mark. The first step in activating the rook in the opening is the act of castling. This move serves two essential purposes. It places the king into a safer position, away from the center of the board where it is vulnerable to attack, and it brings one of the rooks into play. Castling is a critical moment in the opening for both players, as it represents a shift from defense to offense, opening up lines for the rooks and preparing them for future activity. When a player castles, typically the rook on the side castled to will be moved from its original square to a more central location, usually to a square like f1 or f8. This early rook movement is often underestimated, but it sets the stage for much of the strategic maneuvering that will follow. By moving the rook to its new position, it's now ready to join the battle for control of the board. Though it might not be in an optimal position just yet, castling ensures that the rook is no longer confined to its starting position, where it might remain irrelevant for much of the early game. As the game develops, the ability to quickly activate the rook and place it in a more strategic role is one of the defining features of a strong player's opening play. In addition to castling, another critical consideration in the opening is the development of pawns and minor pieces. The rook's power becomes significantly more impactful once the central pawn structure has been cleared, allowing for the opening of lines for the rooks to move. This is why a solid pawn structure is essential for effective rook deployment. By moving pawns and developing knights and bishops, players begin to open up lanes for their rooks, creating open files and ranks. The idea is to place the rook on these open files where it can start to exert pressure on the opponent, controlling key squares and limiting the opponent's options. A crucial element of rook development is timing. Rooks are often most effective when they are placed on open files, where they can exert their influence across the entire board. However, it's important to recognize when it is the right moment to move the rook into an open file. Prematurely placing the rook in an open file can expose it to unnecessary attack, especially when the opponent has not yet developed their pieces. Instead, it's often wiser to wait for the right moment when the position is more favorable, ensuring that the rook will not be prematurely attacked or left without support. The subtle timing of activating the rook makes the difference between a successful and failed opening strategy. Once the rook has been brought into the game, it becomes an active participant in the overall positioning of pieces. The first few moves in the opening are often focused on developing the minor pieces and ensuring the center is controlled. After the minor pieces are developed, however, the board begins to open up, and the rooks can start to take advantage of this newfound space. The key is to avoid letting the rooks remain passive in the corner for too long. While the early development of pawns and knights often dominates the opening phase, the rooks begin to hold a central role in the middle game. The goal is to find the right balance between bringing the rooks into active positions and not overcommitting them too early. A powerful, strategic move in the opening involves connecting the rooks. Once both rooks are on their respective first or second ranks, and the minor pieces are developed, the rooks can be placed in a position where they protect each other and support one another. This connection provides additional strength and flexibility, as both rooks can now operate in tandem, whether on the same file or across different parts of the board. Connecting the rooks ensures that they can act as a unified force, doubling the pressure on key squares and providing a sense of psychological strength that the opponent must contend with. In the modern era of chess, one of the most important opening principles is to place the rooks on the most active files as soon as possible. An open file is one that is either devoid of pawns or only has the opponent's pawns occupying it. By occupying an open file, a rook has a strong presence, and it allows for a more aggressive, flexible positioning. Players often aim to place one rook on an open file early in the game, after the pieces have been developed, but before committing to any more aggressive strategies. It's during this phase that rooks can often cause significant pressure on the opponent's position, either through direct attacks or by limiting the opponent's freedom of movement. Rooks also thrive when they work together with other pieces, particularly when they coordinate with the queen or minor pieces. For instance, in many opening strategies, a well-placed rook can support the queen's attack on the opponent's position. The queen and rook often form a dynamic combination, with the rook occupying key open lines and the queen providing a more mobile attack. Such coordination between rooks and other pieces requires a deep understanding of the opening theory and a keen sense of the board's shifting dynamics. As the game progresses, the ability to transition seamlessly from defense to attack with the rooks becomes one of the marks of a highly skilled player. Another key consideration in the opening phase is the idea of tempo. The rook, while it does not have the same rapid mobility as the queen or knight, can exert significant pressure if it is placed on the right file or rank early. The early rook placement in the opening should aim to maximize tempo by forcing the opponent into uncomfortable positions. Whether this means placing the rook on an open file or preparing it to double with another rook, creating threats early in the game with the rook forces the opponent to respond. This often leads to mistakes or miscalculations, as they are pressured into reacting rather than implementing their own plan. It's also worth noting that the act of castling and moving the rook into play doesn't just open up strategic possibilities for the player. It also signals to the opponent that the player's pieces are becoming more active. This can have a psychological effect, as the opponent knows that their opponent's rook is now a force to be reckoned with. This psychological edge is another aspect of rook play in the opening. When you are the first player to castle and develop your rooks, it often places the opponent on the defensive, as they know their own rooks and king are not yet fully mobilized. In conclusion, while the rook's role in the opening phase may not be as immediately noticeable as that of the queen or knights, it is a piece that can shape the course of the game if activated effectively. The opening's primary aim is to develop the pieces and ensure the king's safety, but it is also about laying the groundwork for future strategic moves. Once the rooks are brought into the game, through castling, connecting with the other rook, or occupying open files, their power begins to emerge. A well-timed and strategically placed rook can completely transform the opening phase from a simple development exercise into a launchpad for a powerful middle game. Recognizing the importance of rook activation in the opening is a crucial skill for any player seeking to gain an edge early in the game. The rook's power in controlling open files is one of its most defining strengths and a key to understanding its potential in a game of chess. Open files, those without any pawns occupying them, become vital battlegrounds for rooks, as they allow these pieces to exert dominance across the board. The psychological and tactical implications of an open file are immense, both for the player controlling it and for the opponent who must contend with its pressure. Rooks thrive when they are placed on these files, and understanding how to control and utilize them is essential for players seeking to leverage their rooks to maximum effect. An open file essentially represents a corridor that allows the rook to travel across the board with great freedom, reaching crucial areas that might otherwise be difficult to access. The concept of controlling an open file isn't limited to merely placing a rook on it. It also involves positioning the rook in a way that maximizes its influence over the opponent's position, restricts their movement, and pressures critical squares. A rook on an open file can dominate the game by controlling vital lines of attack, preventing the opponent from easily advancing their pawns or placing their own pieces on those squares. It is one of the primary ways to achieve a material advantage or create tactical opportunities that can turn the game in your favor. A fundamental strategy for using rooks effectively is to place them on open files as soon as the board allows. During the opening, both players typically work to develop their pieces while ensuring that their pawns remain in the center, protecting their position. As the game progresses, the center of the board may clear, allowing these open files to emerge. Once these open files are available, rooks can quickly take up positions where they can exert significant control over the board. The transition from the opening to the middle game is often characterized by the rook's gradual movement into these key areas. This phase is crucial because it's at this point that the game shifts from development to deeper strategy, with the rooks taking their place at the forefront of any offensive or defensive operations. The ideal placement of a rook on an open file is usually at the top or bottom of that file. When a rook occupies one of these key squares, it can control the entire file, making it much more difficult for the opponent to maneuver their pieces along that line. The presence of a rook on an open file can block the opponent's pawns from advancing, essentially forcing them to reconsider their entire pawn structure. In some cases, this can lead to the opponent's pawns becoming fixed in place, unable to advance, and therefore limiting their ability to generate threats. On the other hand, the player who controls the open file with a rook has much greater flexibility, as their pieces can move freely along the file to pressure weak points in the opponent's position. One of the most potent ways to exert pressure on an open file is by doubling rooks, placing 2 rooks on the same file. This strategy is incredibly powerful, as 2 rooks on a single open file increase the pressure exponentially. The combined force of 2 rooks on the same file creates a dual threat that is incredibly difficult to defend against. The opponent must now deal with the possibility of both rooks working in tandem, attacking the same weak points or covering each other's back. A doubled rook on an open file can also facilitate various tactical ideas, such as pinning, skewering, and attacking the opponent's position from multiple angles. The psychological pressure of facing a doubled rook on an open file can be overwhelming, as it demands constant vigilance and defense, often leading to mistakes or forced responses. While doubling rooks on an open file is a potent strategy, it's also important to understand when to execute this maneuver. Timing is crucial. If you double your rooks too early without sufficient support or a clear plan, you risk overcommitting and leaving your pieces exposed. Conversely, delaying this tactic can give the opponent time to neutralize the open file or place their own pieces in a position where they can counterattack effectively. Mastering the timing of doubling rooks requires a keen understanding of both the position on the board and the psychological impact on the opponent. A well-timed doubling of rooks can tilt the balance of the game in your favor, providing not only an offensive advantage, but also the mental pressure to force your opponent into defensive positions. A well-placed rook on an open file can also facilitate the advancement of pawns. When the opponent's defenses are being pressured by a rook controlling an open file, their attention is divided, and they may struggle to focus on advancing their own pawns or securing their king. The rook can act as a shield or a support piece, allowing pawns to move forward or helping to clear the path for other pieces to advance. This coordination between the rook and the pawns creates a powerful synergy, where the rook's influence on the open file supports the entire structure of your position, making it difficult for the opponent to mount a counterattack. The psychological aspect of controlling open files cannot be overstated. Rooks on open files are not just powerful because of their reach, but also because of the constant pressure they place on the opponent. A rook controlling an open file forces the opponent to constantly reassess their moves, as they must consider the potential threats along that line at all times. This creates a sense of unease, especially for less experienced players, who might struggle to adequately defend against the combined threats of a rook controlling the file and the pieces that accompany it. The mere presence of a rook on an open file can restrict the opponent's ability to maneuver, creating a mental burden that can lead to errors in calculation or hasty moves. Controlling open files also forces the opponent into difficult choices, as their options for advancing their pawns or developing their pieces become limited. They may have to resort to defensive maneuvers that put them at a disadvantage. They might need to protect their pawns from being attacked or reposition their pieces to block the rook's progress, but this takes valuable time and resources. The player controlling the open file can capitalize on this by continuing to develop their position, threatening new lines of attack, or even preparing to invade the opponent's territory through other means. This constant pressure builds over time, often leading to a material advantage or a decisive position. It is important to remember that controlling open files is not just about occupying space. It is also about understanding how to use that control effectively. The key to this strategy is not just placing rooks on open files, but also recognizing how to coordinate them with other pieces to launch attacks or support defensive structures. The interplay between the rooks, pawns, knights, and bishops is crucial in making open files a truly effective weapon. While the rook's dominance on an open file is significant, its true strength lies in its ability to work with the entire army, creating a multifaceted strategy that forces the opponent to constantly respond to new threats. In conclusion, the ability to control open files with rooks is one of the most powerful and effective strategies in chess. By placing rooks on open files, players can dominate large sections of the board, apply continuous pressure to the opponent, and limit their opponent's options. The combination of strategic placement, tactical maneuvers such as doubling rooks, and the psychological pressure exerted by controlling these open files can often be the difference between victory and defeat. The rook's potential is fully realized when it is allowed to control open files, making it a crucial piece in both the middle game and end game. Understanding how to identify and exploit open files is a fundamental skill that every chess player must master in order to achieve success. Rooks are among the most versatile pieces in chess, and their ability to control key squares and dominate the board becomes particularly evident in the middle game. Once the opening phase has passed and the position begins to open up, rooks can transition from a relatively passive role to one of active engagement, positioning themselves on open files and ranks to threaten the opponent's structure and force them into defensive postures. It is during this stage that the rook's power truly begins to unfold, and understanding how to employ this strength is key to transforming a solid position into a winning one. The middle game is where the complexities of the chessboard become most pronounced, and the potential of each piece is tested. During this phase, the rook moves beyond its initial defensive role and starts to become an offensive weapon. This transition is critical, as the placement of the rooks often determines the outcome of the game. Players who successfully position their rooks on critical open files or behind advancing pawns often create significant threats that their opponents must address immediately. The ability to execute tactical strikes using the rooks, such as attacks on weak pawns, back-rank threats, and coordination with other pieces, becomes a defining aspect of strong play during the middle game. One of the most common tactical applications of the rook in the middle game is its ability to cut off the opponent's king from escaping, especially if the king is positioned on an open rank or file. The rook's long-range movement is a perfect tool for creating situations where the opponent's king has no safe squares to move to. By placing a rook on a rank or file that cuts off the king's escape routes, a player can force the opponent to move their other pieces in defense of the king. This creates immediate threats, forcing the opponent to devote significant resources to protecting their king and often leading to weaknesses elsewhere in their position. Rooks also excel in creating powerful pressure against weak pawns. As the game develops, pawns often become the focal point of both attack and defense. When pawns become isolated or weak, either due to being overextended or being cut off from their supporting pawns, they become prime targets for the rooks. A rook placed behind a weak pawn can attack it directly, or it can restrict the movement of the opponent's pawns, preventing them from advancing. The idea is to use the rook's linear movement to limit the opponent's pawn mobility, forcing them to divert attention to protecting these weak pawns, which may create tactical opportunities elsewhere on the board. Additionally, rooks can coordinate with other pieces to create strong, attacking formations. One of the most effective ways to achieve this is by pairing rooks together on the same file or rank, forming a battery that can overwhelm the opponent's defenses. This tactic can be particularly effective when attacking a defended piece or preparing for a breakthrough. By doubling up the rooks, the player increases the pressure on any key squares, making it difficult for the opponent to defend effectively. Such coordination is critical, as it allows rooks to complement each other in ways that other pieces cannot, amplifying their influence on the game. A less obvious, but equally important, tactical use of the rook is its ability to restrict the opponent's piece mobility. In positions where the opponent's pieces are cramped or blocked in, placing a rook on a key open file or rank can restrict the opponent's ability to coordinate their pieces effectively. This forces the opponent to waste valuable moves, repositioning their pieces or defending against threats, which in turn slows their development and allows the player controlling the rooks to seize the initiative. Rooks are also effective in creating threats that stretch the opponent's resources thin. A well-placed rook can focus on an opponent's weak spot, forcing them to respond with multiple pieces in order to defend against a potential attack. This overload can lead to material loss or a positional disadvantage. The rook's ability to control long distances allows it to attack over large sections of the board, creating threats that might not have been immediately obvious. These threats often require the opponent to move their pieces to defensive positions, leaving their own attack weaker or their coordination impaired. Another key feature of the rook's power in the middle game is its ability to coordinate with other pieces, especially the queen. A common tactic is to have the queen and a rook support one another in attacking a critical weakness in the opponent's camp. Whether it's targeting a vulnerable pawn or creating a pin or skewer, the combined strength of the queen and rook on the same file or rank can be overwhelming. This coordination allows the player to attack multiple targets at once, or to create a net that gradually tightens around the opponent's position. The sheer force of such combined attacks often forces the opponent into making concessions, whether through weakening their position or even offering material to break the pressure. When using rooks in the middle game, it is also important to consider their defensive roles. While rooks are often associated with attacking, they can also be critical defenders in maintaining the integrity of the position. For example, a rook can be used to defend the back rank, preventing the opponent from executing a back rank checkmate or using their own rooks to invade your position. Placing a rook on the back rank to protect against checkmate is one of the fundamental defensive uses of the rook, and it should be done proactively to avoid surprises later in the game. The psychological pressure created by rooks in the middle game is another facet of their strength. Rooks can create an aura of inevitability, forcing the opponent to either deal with the immediate threat or risk being overwhelmed. The threat of a rook entering an open file or doubling on a crucial file can lead to mistakes, as the opponent feels the weight of the attack and is forced to react. By maintaining constant pressure and making threats that are hard to ignore, the player controlling the rooks can create an environment where the opponent is always on the defensive, never able to fully implement their own plans. Rooks are particularly powerful in positions where they can be placed behind an attacking pawn. In such cases, the rook acts as a support piece, helping the pawn advance to a more dangerous square or creating multiple threats along the same rank or file. This tactic is often used in endgames, but it can also be effective in the middle game, especially when a pawn is close to promotion or when it has already reached the opponent's territory. In such situations, the combined strength of the pawn and the rook can overwhelm the opponent's defenses and force them into a position where they are either unable to stop the pawn's advance or must sacrifice material to prevent a promotion. The ability of the rook to control key squares in the middle game extends beyond simple threats. In many cases, the placement of a rook can force the opponent to abandon certain plans or lines of attack. For example, by placing a rook on an open file, a player can prevent the opponent from advancing their own pieces, especially pawns. This control of space, even if not directly threatening the opponent's pieces, can create a passive position for the opponent, limiting their freedom of movement and restricting their options. The tactical nature of the rook's power is not only about direct attacks, but also about creating these subtle barriers that force the opponent to play defensively. The positioning of rooks in the middle game can also be a tool for controlling tempo. Rooks are often most effective when they are placed on active files or ranks, where they can threaten key squares. By doing so, the player forces their opponent to react to the threats posed by the rooks, often dictating the flow of the game. The idea is to use the rook's ability to create threats across the board to ensure that the opponent spends time and energy reacting to those threats, thus gaining valuable tempo to advance one's own plan. Rooks also become much more dangerous in the middle game when the board is cleared of minor pieces. As the pawns and knights are exchanged, the rooks are left to dominate the open lines. The transition from the opening phase, with its more cramped and closed nature, to the middle game, where the position tends to open up, is a key moment for rooks. Once the minor pieces have been removed from the board, the rooks are free to move across large sections of the board, attacking and coordinating with other pieces, particularly the queen and pawns. This increase in freedom is what makes rooks such valuable assets in the middle game. In conclusion, the rook's role in the middle game is multifaceted and highly strategic. Whether attacking weak pawns, controlling open files, coordinating with other pieces, or defending key squares, the rook's power comes from its ability to dominate large portions of the board. Its long-range mobility allows it to create constant pressure, forcing the opponent into defensive positions and limiting their ability to carry out their own plans. Understanding how to position and use rooks effectively during the middle game is crucial for any player seeking to gain an upper hand and transition into the endgame with a strong advantage. Rooks play a crucial role in the endgame, where their power often reaches its peak. As the board clears and fewer pieces remain, rooks become the central pieces in securing victory, executing precise maneuvers, and converting an advantage into a checkmate. Understanding how to handle rooks in the endgame is vital for converting a small advantage into a win, defending against a larger opponent, or avoiding unnecessary risks. The nature of the endgame, with fewer pieces and more open lines, highlights the rook's unique strengths and tactical potential. It is here that the psychological pressure exerted by the rook often forces the opponent into making mistakes, and the ability to maximize its potential becomes a key factor in determining the outcome of the game. One of the most significant aspects of rook play in the endgame is its capacity to dominate open files. With fewer pawns on the board, the remaining rooks have more freedom to control long stretches of the board, and open files become essential for making progress. A rook placed on an open file not only controls key squares, but also restricts the movement of the opponent's pieces. By placing a rook on an open file, a player can prevent the opponent from using that file to advance their own pawns or maneuver their king, often forcing the opponent into a passive position. This control of space is crucial in the endgame, where the reduced material means that each move carries more weight. The psychological pressure of having a rook dominate an open file, especially when the opponent has fewer pieces to contest it, can significantly increase the difficulty of defending against the attack. Rooks are also incredibly powerful when placed behind passed pawns. Passed pawns, which are pawns that have no opposing pawns to block their advancement on their file, represent a major threat in the endgame. When a passed pawn is advanced, it becomes a key target for the opponent to block or capture, and the defending player must take great care in trying to neutralize it. However, a rook placed behind a passed pawn serves as a perfect support piece. By staying behind the pawn, the rook can protect it while also threatening the opponent's position, making it extremely difficult for the defender to stop the pawn's march toward promotion. This setup can create multiple threats at once, forcing the opponent to devote more and more resources to defending the pawn and potentially leaving their own position vulnerable to attack. In some endgame positions, rooks are used to restrict the opponent's king's movement. When the opponent's king is confined to a limited area of the board, it becomes much easier to force a checkmate or at least gain a significant material advantage. By placing the rook in a way that blocks the king's escape routes, such as placing it on a file or rank where the king cannot cross, players can systematically reduce the area in which the opposing king can move. This technique is especially useful when the opponent's king is in a corner or at the edge of the board. The combination of the rook's long-range movement and the opponent's reduced mobility creates a powerful strategy for gradually forcing the opponent into a checkmate or a defensive position where they can no longer resist. Another essential feature of rooks in the endgame is their ability to cut off opposing kings from the rest of the board. Rooks excel at creating barriers that separate the opponent's king from its remaining pieces. When the opponent's king is cut off, it becomes more difficult for them to coordinate a defense, and their remaining pieces are often forced into passive positions. In many cases, this tactic can set up a deadly attack, with the rook controlling key squares and forcing the opponent to sacrifice material in order to free their king or escape a checkmate. By preventing the king from joining forces with the remaining pawns or pieces, the player can convert a significant material or positional advantage into a winning endgame scenario. Rooks are also invaluable when it comes to converting an advantage in material into a victory. If a player has managed to win a pawn or a piece in the middle game or early endgame, it's often the rook's role to ensure that the advantage is maintained and eventually leads to a checkmate. Rooks can be used to attack the opponent's weak pawns or defend the player's own, and they are particularly effective when it comes to targeting isolated pawns or pawns that are about to be promoted. The ability of the rook to restrict the movement of the opponent's pieces and cut off escape routes creates an environment in which the opponent's material advantage can be neutralized, and the player with the rooks can gradually press for a decisive outcome. One of the key tactics for using rooks effectively in the endgame is the concept of rook behind pawns. Whether it is one's own passed pawn or the opponent's, placing the rook behind a pawn supports its advance, creating threats of promotion while also providing defense from the opponent's attack. In the case of a passed pawn, having the rook behind it adds pressure, making it harder for the opponent to prevent the pawn from advancing. The coordination between a rook and a passed pawn can be overwhelming, often forcing the opponent to make concessions, such as sacrificing material or allowing a pawn to promote. Rooks can also be used to systematically invade the opponent's position, especially in the case of the endgame, when the opponent is vulnerable. A classic endgame tactic involves placing a rook on the opponent's second rank, where it can restrict the opponent's king's movement, attack weak pawns, and create double threats that are difficult to defend. Once the rook has successfully penetrated the opponent's position, it often becomes a decisive factor, either forcing the opponent to abandon key squares or blundering into a checkmate sequence. This tactic, called penetration, takes advantage of the rook's ability to control entire ranks and files, and it can be particularly devastating when the opponent's defenses are weakened and their pieces are scattered. The endgame also highlights the rook's ability to support pawns in promotion. Whether the player is advancing their own pawns or trying to stop the opponent from doing so, rooks play a pivotal role in ensuring that pawns are safely promoted into queens. The rook can clear the path for the pawn by attacking the opponent's defending pieces, or it can support the pawn by blocking the opponent's rooks or pieces that attempt to stop it. This coordination between the rook and pawn is a critical endgame strategy that often leads to a promoted pawn, which then becomes a powerful new queen. In many cases, the ability to promote a pawn is the turning point in the game, and rooks are indispensable in facilitating this process. In the event that both players are left with rooks and kings in the endgame, the player with better technique can often win by using their rook to restrict the opponent's king's movement. The key to winning in such situations lies in creating a situation where the opponent's king is forced into a corner, and the rooks can coordinate to deliver checkmate. This process can involve systematically driving the opponent's king to the edge of the board, while using the rooks to block the opponent's escape. Once the king is on the edge or in a corner, a checkmate can be delivered using the rook's ability to cover multiple escape squares. However, in some endgame positions, it's not enough to simply have a material advantage or dominate the opponent's king's position. Timing and precision are critical. The endgame is about careful calculation, and rooks, when placed and coordinated correctly, can lead to swift victories. Overextending a rook, moving it too quickly without sufficient coordination with the other pieces, can lead to mistakes that allow the opponent to defend or counterattack. Rook endgames often require patience and calculation, as the player must carefully maneuver their rook and other pieces to force the opponent into a losing position. In conclusion, the role of rooks in the endgame is immense. Their long-range movement, ability to dominate files, and versatility in supporting pawns or attacking weak points make them indispensable tools in securing victory. Whether it's by advancing past pawns, cutting off the opponent's king's movement, invading the opponent's position, or coordinating for checkmate, rooks are central to most successful endgames. By understanding how to deploy rooks effectively, players can not only convert their advantages into checkmate, but also put enormous psychological pressure on their opponents, forcing them into mistakes or unfavorable positions. the endgame is where the rook's power shines most brightly, and mastering its use in this phase is essential for any player looking to win at the highest level. Rooks are deeply connected to the psychological elements of chess, and their influence extends far beyond their tactical and strategic roles. Understanding the psychological pressure that a well-placed rook can create, as well as the inherent mindset required to wield the rook effectively, can give a player a significant advantage. The presence of a rook on the board evokes a series of mental dynamics that can be either overwhelming or reassuring to both players, depending on the context. As such, mastering the psychological aspects of rook play can be just as important as understanding their physical movement and position on the board. One of the most powerful psychological tools that rooks bring to the game is their ability to create a sense of inevitability. When a rook is placed on an open file, controlling key ranks and squares, it often forces the opponent into a passive posture. This creates a psychological pressure where the opponent feels trapped, unable to move freely without risking serious consequences. The opponent may begin to fear the potential attacks that could arise from the rook's increasing dominance over the board. Even though the rook has not yet launched a direct attack, its mere presence in an open file or behind an advancing pawn can create a looming threat, one that psychologically drives the opponent to play more cautiously, overthinking every move in order to avoid falling into a trap. The ability to control large swaths of the board is another key psychological factor when using rooks. The vast reach of a rook can make an opponent feel overwhelmed. When placed on an open file or rank, the rook exerts control over multiple squares, limiting the opponent's ability to maneuver. This forces the opponent into a defensive mindset, as they must always keep in mind the rook's ability to strike at any moment. The psychological effect is similar to the feeling of being stalked. There's always a sense of tension, as the opponent knows that the situation is perilous and must be handled with extreme caution. The longer the rook maintains this pressure, the more likely it is that the opponent will make a mistake, whether out of anxiety or a desire to relieve the pressure. Rooks also have the ability to unsettle an opponent by threatening multiple targets simultaneously. A rook can be used to attack weak pawns, defend key squares, or even prepare for a checkmate, all while the opponent is forced to respond to several different threats at once. This is often referred to as creating double threats, and it is a potent psychological tactic. The opponent may feel as if they are constantly reacting to these threats without the opportunity to develop their own plan. This sense of being on the defensive can create mental fatigue, leading to mistakes. Players who can effectively create multiple threats with their rooks often have the psychological advantage, as they force their opponent to divide their attention, increasing the chances of them overlooking something important. In the middle and end game, rooks can act as a psychological tool for forcing the opponent into a state of tunnel vision. In situations where the opponent is under heavy attack or surrounded by threats, they may focus exclusively on defending against those threats, losing sight of other important aspects of the game. This tunnel vision often occurs when the opponent is overly focused on a rook that is attacking a specific target, such as a weak pawn, a king that is cornered, or a back-rank mate. By keeping the opponent's attention fixed on one area of the board, a player can then launch a surprise attack in another area, exploiting the lack of awareness of the full board. This ability to distract, misdirect, and create multiple levels of threats is a psychological strategy that can lead to material gain or even checkmate. Another psychological element of rook play comes from the concept of rook coordination. When two rooks work together on the same file or rank, they form a powerful unit that can overwhelm the opponent's defenses. This coordination, however, is not just a tactical advantage. It also has a psychological effect on the opponent. Facing two rooks working in tandem is intimidating, as it often signals the beginning of a decisive attack. The opponent knows that if they do not act quickly, the combined pressure of the rooks can lead to devastating consequences. This psychological fear can force the opponent to make ill-advised moves as they try to avoid being overwhelmed by the coordinated attack. The psychology of rook play also comes into play in the endgame, where the fewer pieces on the board amplify the pressure. In endgame situations, where the margin for error is often razor-thin, the psychological warfare intensifies. A single mistake can cost the game, and the player wielding the rook can often capitalize on this by forcing the opponent into making a rushed or panic-driven decision. The player with the rook can maintain constant pressure, subtly reducing the opponent's options until they feel cornered. This constant tension can wear down the opponent mentally, making them more susceptible to blunders or hasty moves that give the player with the rook the upper hand. Furthermore, rooks can have a psychological impact in situations of zugzwang, where any move the opponent makes worsens their position. In such situations, a rook can deliver a sense of inevitability, as the opponent feels trapped in a corner with no good options. When the opponent's king is forced into a confined space, with their rooks or other pieces blocking the escape, the psychological pressure becomes intense. The player with the rook has a wide range of choices for how to tighten the noose, and the opponent knows that any move they make will only hasten their defeat. This creates a type of mental paralysis, where the opponent knows they are losing but cannot figure out how to stop it. The player with the rook can capitalize on this psychological state, methodically completing the checkmate or gaining a significant material advantage. Another psychological tactic when using rooks involves baiting the opponent into making a move that seems safe, but ultimately leads to a losing position. For example, by placing a rook on a file that appears neutral, the player may entice the opponent into thinking they can move their pieces safely. However, this bait often sets up a hidden trap, such as a sudden attack on the opponent's weak pawns or an incoming checkmate. The psychological element here is that the opponent feels overconfident or relieved when the rook seems to be out of play, only to realize too late that they've walked into a calculated trap. This sense of surprise and the emotional shock of losing a piece or position that seemed secure can be debilitating for the opponent. One of the key psychological strengths of rooks is the way they can be used to build up a feeling of dominance. As the game progresses, especially in the middle game and end game, rooks often take on more commanding roles. A well-placed rook can make the opponent feel like they are constantly under siege, unable to escape the pressing threat that looms over them. This creates a situation where the opponent is not only worried about immediate threats, but is also continuously fearful of the long-term consequences of their position. The constant awareness that a rook can strike at any time increases the psychological burden on the opponent, and often this fear can cause them to act hastily, making mistakes that can cost them the game. The psychological impact of rooks is not limited to just creating pressure. It also extends to the way they affect the flow of the game. When rooks are active and well coordinated, they change the tempo of the game. The player with the active rooks controls the pace, forcing the opponent to react rather than plan their own moves. This disruption of the opponent's rhythm can lead to a sense of confusion or frustration, further contributing to psychological stress. In this way, rooks can be seen as tempo controllers, able to shift the balance of the game in subtle but impactful ways. Finally, there is a sense of psychological satisfaction that comes from a well-executed rook maneuver, particularly when it results in checkmate. The simplicity and elegance of a rook delivering checkmate can create a sense of satisfaction not just for the player, but also for the audience of the game, should they be watching. The finality of a rook's strike, whether it is a back-rank mate, a checkmate supported by a pawn, or a clever maneuver to trap the opponent's king, has an air of precision and authority that emphasizes the rook's power. This can add an additional psychological element to the game, as the opponent is not only losing, but is losing to a piece that, through intelligent play, has carefully crafted the final blow. In conclusion, the psychological aspects of rook play are just as important as their technical uses in the game. By understanding the ways rooks can create pressure, manipulate tempo, and induce fear and overconfidence, players can use them as a tool for mental warfare. The psychological impact of a rook's presence on the board can force the opponent into a defensive mindset, create confusion, and induce mistakes. By mastering not only the mechanical aspects of rook movement, but also the psychological tactics associated with them, a player can gain an edge that is as much mental as it is positional. The rook's potential to control and manipulate space is one of the most significant aspects of its power in chess. As a piece with both long-range and versatile movement, the rook can dominate large portions of the board and create vast zones of influence. Understanding the psychology of space control through the rook can elevate a player's game to new heights. Rooks are unique in their ability to control both files and ranks simultaneously, allowing players to strategically restrict their opponent's options, limit their mobility, and shape the flow of the game. The psychological effect of space control in chess cannot be overstated. It often forces the opponent into a defensive, reactive state, preventing them from playing proactively and dictating the course of the game. The first key element of space control with rooks is their ability to restrict the movement of the opponent's pieces, especially the king. In many endgame situations, controlling space means restricting the opponent's king's access to key squares or entire sections of the board. The rook's ability to dominate ranks and files ensures that the opponent's king is often limited to a small area. The psychological pressure of having the king confined to a small space increases as the game progresses. The opponent may begin to feel as if they are suffocating, unable to make a move that doesn't lead to a worsening of their position. Rooks are particularly effective at controlling squares that are crucial for both defense and offense. When a rook occupies an open file or rank, it cuts off the opponent's ability to freely move their pieces across the board, often forcing them into awkward defensive maneuvers. As the game enters the later stages, rooks become even more dangerous because they are able to control vast expanses of the board, often dictating the terms of the game from multiple angles. This power to control space is especially apparent when both players are left with only rooks and kings on the board. At this stage, the player who successfully uses their rooks to control key files or ranks can impose a tempo on the opponent, forcing them to react to threats instead of pursuing their own plans. The psychological impact of this can be significant, as the opponent may begin to feel overwhelmed by the control exerted by the rooks. When space is controlled, it limits the opponent's ability to create counterplay, which can result in an increasing sense of helplessness. In particular, rooks are incredibly effective when placed on the opponent's 2nd or 7th rank, especially when the opponent's king is confined to a corner or edge. The psychological effect of such placement is immense because it not only limits the opponent's space, but also presents a constant threat of back-rank mates or other direct attacks. This situation forces the opponent into a defensive position, where they must deal with the immediate threat posed by the rook while also attempting to find a way to escape the control of space. Often, when a rook dominates such critical areas of the board, the opponent's options are severely constrained, and they are forced into making moves that may not improve their position. This feeling of being squeezed can psychologically break down a player's confidence, especially if they find themselves unable to break free from the pressure. The space control provided by rooks extends beyond the immediate control of ranks and files. It also has a profound effect on the opponent's piece coordination. When a rook is placed on an open file or rank, it often has the secondary effect of preventing the opponent's pieces from interacting effectively. For example, an opponent's pawns might be unable to advance without the risk of being attacked by the rook, while their other pieces may be unable to move due to the rook's dominance over key squares. This disruption of piece coordination can create significant psychological stress, as the opponent may feel as if they are playing a passive game, merely reacting to the threats posed by the rook instead of initiating their own plans. A particularly effective psychological tactic is to use the rook to control multiple areas of the board simultaneously. By moving the rook between different files and ranks, a player can continually shift the focus of the game and keep the opponent guessing about the next threat. This shifting of focus forces the opponent to constantly readjust their defenses, further reducing their ability to create a coherent strategy. The psychological effect of being unable to predict where the rook will strike next can be incredibly disorienting for the opponent, causing them to second-guess their moves and potentially miscalculate their responses. Another key psychological factor in space control is the concept of overextension. When a rook is used aggressively and the player starts pushing their pieces too far ahead, there is the potential to overextend. However, this type of aggressive rook play can be psychologically disarming to the opponent, as it may initially seem as though the player has overreached. The opponent may believe that the player has left themselves vulnerable, or that they are attempting to gain too much too quickly. This illusion of vulnerability often lures the opponent into making a move that worsens their position, allowing the player to capitalize on their overextension by using their rook to regain control of the space. This delicate balance of creating tension through overextension, while ensuring that it does not lead to the player's own downfall, is an important psychological strategy that makes the rook an even more formidable weapon. Rooks are also incredibly powerful when they work in tandem with pawns, particularly in endgame situations. The interaction between rooks and pawns allows for a unique form of space control, where the rook can protect the pawn and limit the opponent's ability to prevent its advancement. A well-placed rook behind a passed pawn, for example, dominates a large portion of the board, making it difficult for the opponent to stop the pawn's progress without giving up significant material or positional advantage. The psychological effect of this space control is that the opponent knows that stopping the pawn will require a large investment of resources, often resulting in the loss of important pieces or positions. The psychological pressure mounts as the player with the rook can advance their pawn without much resistance, leading to the eventual promotion of a new queen. This scenario forces the opponent into a defensive posture, where they must constantly monitor the advancing pawn, while also trying to figure out a way to break the space control imposed by the rook. One of the most effective ways rooks exert control over space is by limiting the movement of enemy pieces. As the opponent's pieces are forced to remain within a confined area, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to find counterplay. A well-placed rook can lock down key squares or block off vital lines of attack, rendering the opponent's pieces ineffective. This type of spatial control not only makes it harder for the opponent to coordinate their pieces, but also builds a sense of helplessness. The psychological impact of being unable to move freely can cause frustration and lead to poor decision-making, as the opponent may become increasingly desperate to regain the initiative. When discussing space control, it is also important to recognize the psychological power of space denial. Rooks are especially effective at denying the opponent access to critical areas of the board. This can involve blocking the opponent from advancing their pawns, preventing their king from escaping a confined area, or even disrupting the movement of their other pieces. Denying the opponent the opportunity to expand or create breathing room can lead to a significant loss of morale, as it feels as though their options are becoming increasingly limited. The longer the player with the rook maintains this denial of space, the more likely the opponent is to become mentally exhausted, making mistakes out of frustration or anxiety. In addition, rooks are often able to capitalize on the space created by their presence in a given area. Once the opponent's pieces are restricted, the player with the rook can begin to advance their own pawns or shift their focus toward a more aggressive attack. The ability to smoothly transition between defending space and aggressively expanding one's position is a hallmark of high-level rook play. This ability to control space while simultaneously transitioning to the attack puts the opponent in a difficult position, where they are constantly forced to react to multiple threats. The mental fatigue from having to monitor such a wide array of possibilities can eventually lead to errors, allowing the player with the rook to take control of the game entirely. Ultimately, the psychological element of space control with rooks is about exerting dominance and making the opponent feel as though they are unable to break free from the pressure. The key to successful rook play lies in recognizing opportunities for creating space, controlling large areas of the board, and strategically limiting the opponent's movement. The psychological impact of this control is profound, as it forces the opponent into a passive and defensive role, unable to create meaningful counterplay. By mastering the art of space control through rooks, a player can dictate the pace of the game and gradually break down the opponent's resistance, paving the way for victory. The role of the rook in the endgame is particularly critical, and its psychological impact can often be the deciding factor between victory and defeat. As the game progresses and the number of pieces on the board diminishes, rooks gain greater influence. The presence of a rook in the endgame can create a psychological pressure on the opponent as they realize that even small mistakes can be catastrophic, and the game can rapidly shift in favor of the player wielding the rook. This transition from a crowded, tactical middle game to a more open, strategic endgame allows the rook to demonstrate its full potential, and understanding the psychological elements at play during this stage can turn the tide in a player's favor. The endgame often involves fewer pieces and more open space, which makes the rooks much more powerful. One of the primary psychological tactics that can be deployed in the endgame is the concept of rook activity. A rook that is actively involved in the game, controlling key squares or attacking vulnerable pawns, can create an overwhelming sense of inevitability for the opponent. When a rook is highly active, it can dominate large sections of the board, and the opponent begins to realize that defending against multiple threats can become a hopeless task. The psychological pressure builds as the opponent struggles to cover all the bases, often resulting in mistakes due to anxiety or miscalculations. Rooks are often best used in the endgame to control passed pawns, particularly passed pawns that are close to promotion. The player with a rook in this situation can apply constant pressure on the opponent, who must divert their attention to stopping the pawn while also managing their own defenses. The psychological effect of dealing with a passed pawn is significant. The opponent knows that they are facing an imminent threat and must constantly adjust their plans. The player with the rook can use this to their advantage by creating a situation where the opponent feels like they must sacrifice material or expose their king to further attacks. This type of constant mental pressure is a hallmark of effective endgame rook play, where one mistake can quickly turn the game in the favor of the opponent. Another key psychological concept in endgame rook play is the idea of cutting off the opponent's king. A rook is particularly effective at limiting the movement of the opponent's king, especially in the corner or along the edges of the board. By carefully positioning the rook to restrict the opponent's king's options, the player can psychologically corner their opponent, making them feel trapped. The more confined the opponent's king becomes, the more desperate their attempts to escape. The psychological toll of being trapped, with fewer and fewer moves available, can cause the opponent to rush their decisions, leading to blunders and mistakes. The presence of a rook at the right moment can signal the beginning of a forced checkmate, or, at the very least, an overwhelming position that the opponent cannot easily break free from. When two rooks are involved in the endgame, their combined power is often too much for a single rook or other pieces to counter. The psychological impact of facing two rooks working together is profound, as it often signals the inevitability of a checkmate or overwhelming material loss. The two rooks create a level of control over the board that is nearly impossible to escape. This double threat can disorient the opponent, forcing them to constantly check for potential attacks from multiple angles. The constant need to monitor and respond to both rooks can be mentally exhausting and can lead to mistakes, especially if the player with the rooks can maintain a calm and consistent strategy. As the game nears its conclusion, the psychological dynamics of rook play shift to focus on precision and patience. In the endgame, there is less room for error, and the psychological aspect of maintaining composure under pressure becomes paramount. Players who can maintain a clear strategic vision while navigating the complexities of rook endgames are more likely to emerge victorious. The mental fortitude required to manage rook endgames involves resisting the temptation to rush, and instead carefully considering each move to avoid blunders. The player wielding the rook must create a sense of inevitability through methodical, patient play, pushing the opponent toward a decision that results in their loss. There is also a psychological advantage to having an active rook in endgame positions, involving opposing pawns. A well-placed rook can create constant pressure on the opponent's advancing pawns, forcing them to make awkward moves that either weaken their position or expose them to direct attacks. This scenario puts the opponent on the defensive, constantly scrambling to protect their pawns while trying to make progress with their own plan. The awareness that their pawns are not as safe as they initially seemed creates a level of anxiety, especially as the rook begins to cut off the potential escape routes for their pieces. The psychological shift from middle game to end game, particularly for a player who is confident in their rook's ability to dominate, is striking. Players often feel a sense of accomplishment as their rooks come into their own in the endgame, and this confidence can translate into better decision-making. On the other hand, the opponent may begin to feel a sense of hopelessness as they realize they are losing control over key areas of the board. This shift in perception is crucial. Once the opponent starts to doubt their position, they are more likely to make hurried or ill-considered moves, which can lead to their downfall. Rooks in the endgame also benefit from the ability to create threats from multiple areas of the board. The player with the rook can often execute a strategy where the opponent's attention is divided between defending their king, protecting pawns, and ensuring their pieces are not trapped. This continuous demand for mental energy from the opponent eventually leads to mental fatigue, which can result in mistakes or overlooked tactics. The psychological advantage of being able to control multiple parts of the board simultaneously with a rook can be a game-changing factor, creating confusion and making it more likely for the opponent to misstep. In extreme cases, when the opponent is left with only a king and pawns, the rook has a significant psychological impact by preventing the opponent from advancing their pawns. The mere presence of a rook in the right position can stall the opponent's pawn promotion, often rendering their king powerless to break through. The psychological effect of having no clear path to victory can be devastating for the opponent. Knowing that their pawns cannot advance without being captured or neutralized by the rook, the opponent may begin to lose hope, ultimately leading to a series of panicked moves. These types of endgame positions often result in resignation, as the player with the rook applies the pressure systematically. Finally, in some endgames, a rook can be used to force a draw, even in a losing position. This psychological tactic plays into the opponent's expectations, as they may feel that the endgame will be a straightforward win. When the rook creates enough counterplay or holds the opponent's pieces at bay, the opponent may experience frustration or overconfidence. The presence of the rook can deny the opponent a clean victory, leading them to miscalculate and open the door to a draw or even a reversal of fortunes. As a piece of immense power and strategic depth, the rook's role in the endgame often goes beyond mere piece value. It becomes a psychological weapon. The constant threats it can create, combined with the mental pressure it exerts on the opponent, turn the endgame into a mental battlefield. The player, who can keep their composure and use the rook's power effectively to dominate space and create multiple threats, will find themselves in a favorable position, while the player on the defensive will feel the mounting pressure. Endgame rook play is as much about psychological endurance and precision as it is about tactical awareness. and mastering it can provide the player with an edge that is both mental and physical. The rook's ability to deliver checkmate is often the final and most potent psychological weapon in a chess game. As the opponent's defenses begin to crumble, and their pieces are no longer able to hold the center, the rook's power becomes undeniable. The mere possibility of checkmate creates an almost tangible sense of inevitability that the opponent cannot escape. Whether through a direct assault on the opponent's king or by forcing them into a back-rank mate, the rook brings a psychological finality to the game. The feeling of helplessness that accompanies being checkmated by a rook is one of the most intense experiences a chess player can have, and it is a testament to the rook's ability to control not only the board, but also the mental state of the opponent.